there is this perception that social impact is not profitable. Social impact is charity, they're not sustainable, don't do it. But with blockchain, you reduce all the costs. You cut out the intermediaries. So all of a sudden, social impact project like farming, the president is thinking about, will become profitable.
When I came to state government in the state of Guanajuato, remittances were already a big deal, but out of each dollar remitted from the worker in the United States to his family, the family on the average would only receive 70 cents. So 30% implied either interest rates, implied that most of the money was cash money sent by mail, and of course the mail, just looking after and seeing a bill, was lost. So we started working on that. Finally, today, on the average, in the case of Mexican remittances, those 25 billion now is 1% cost because the banking industry, because Central Bank of Mexico has now, is now participating, it's reduced to 1%. So the problem of efficiency in the transfer and the quickness of the transfer is solved 25 years after it's solved. So now the big deal is how you get those 25 million more than consumed in consumption products to be invested on productive investments, to be invested in family patrimony and investments. So the challenge now is how that family makes a better use of that money, even to build up retirement plan, Medicare plans, and else and else. So we just have to educate people and get to them individually so that they take better investment decisions out of the money they're receiving. The other thing is, and this is where MoneyGram and this come about, is you need a net of places by the thousands in the United States so that migrants can go and deposit their money that they want to transfer, and this is MoneyGram, and there by the thousands are there. And also that you're not requested to be documented, because maybe half of those transferences are done by people that is not documented. So you need that net to get the money, then transfer it, and you need the same thing on the Mexican side. Because the problem in Oaxaca is that these families are up in the mountains. They don't have communications, and there is no cash available there. So finally, the Bimbos, the Coca-Colas, the Oxxos, this extremely successful chain of small retail stores, now over 30,000 of them in Mexico, Oxxos, so they're everywhere, same as the distribution truck of Coca-Cola, distribution truck of Bimbo, reach all these faraway places, and they are raising cash there. So instead of bringing the cash back to the bottling plant or back to the city, they can just exchange it right there. So that even they're being assaulted, they're not going to be assaulted anymore if the money that they raised, they pay there to the transferences. So that is being built. Today in Central Fox, we're a think tank, and we are developing together with MasterCard a debit card to raise the money in United States, wherever it is generated, and to have this MasterCard equivalent in the family in Mexico. So there's a MasterCard in United States for the worker or the migrant, and a MasterCard with the family. And the transfer is going to be done automatically, online, immediate delivery, but the thing is you still have to cash. So what MasterCard has to do is to get those cards to the mom and pop store, to this OXXO network, to this all other places that they have the cash. So, ending up, the challenge today is educate the people that are receiving the money to make the best use of their money, to allocate the money in the most productive way. And that's the big challenge today in the case of Mexico's transferences from migrants.
Thank you, Mr. President. Jeff, you are in education. You're advising a company called BEF2018, and you have some plans about helping people in the remote parts of the world, especially women who have no access to education, or in some part of the world where they cannot go to school because cultural doesn't allow women education and so forth, unfortunately. So this has a huge potential, right? And so tell us a little bit more about your plan of how you're going to disseminate education that will actually help people get jobs, not just education for sake of education. They're tailored. Please go ahead.
Sure. It's important to me to first speak from my patriotism and secondly from my heart. As an American, I want to reassure you, or hope to reassure you, that the overwhelming majority of Americans are completely embarrassed that we have, as his own Secretary of State called him, a moron, as the President of the United States. I lived through the era of Nixon the crook, and the United States got rid of him, and I'm convinced we will remove this crook as well. Now, from my heart, at 68 years old, I've been through a lot, but I've learned that I think the most powerful way to change the world is with education. You have to start there. A lot of the applications for the killer apps on the blockchain that I've heard discussed really have to do with the top 10% of the people in the world. People with property, with bank accounts. What BEF2018 is approaching and what its mission is to break down the walls of exclusivity and allow education to reach everybody at the level that everybody needs. And that's a whole lot of different levels. Some's very early, some is maybe vocational training, some is advanced training, but our mission is to expose and allow over 1 billion people in the world to take advantage of improving their lives through education. I want to introduce the co-founder of BEF2018, who we brought from Vilnius, Dan Stasiulis. Stand up, he's over here. It's a Lithuanian company, and yet it's a worldwide company, one that already has 29 million customers in the world, in the United States, in Brazil, in Indonesia, all over the world. And that's our intention, is to allow people to, and corporations and foundations to sponsor the kind of education that will be most important to any specific constituency, and pay students to learn. In other words, not ask students to pay to learn, but to be paid to learn. And I think that's one of the things that is uniquely possible on the blockchain, and using cryptocurrency. Smart contracts. When a student enters a course, a smart contract is initiated. When he completes a course, the smart contract pays him for having completed it. And it'll be sponsored by those corporations and foundations to whom it's important that education reaches the masses. I think it's something that we will, you'll see in the next, we need some runway, as Miko has said, and yet I think over the next few years, we expect to have billions of people online learning. So that's where we're heading.
Thank you. That's amazing. A lot of good social impact work. And Harvey, you are doing something really amazing, right? In Africa, you did a TED Talk about your cold chain. So why not tell our audience the life you're saving, especially children vaccination, and how blockchain can even take it to the next level?
Right. Thank you, Mira. So in order to go to school, you got to be healthy. In order to run a mom and pop store, mom and pop have to be in the store, not home taking care of Junior, who's sick. So we have prefix and suffix. You all know about blockchain, and you know about supply chain. How many of you know about the cold chain?
Cold chain.
So the cold chain means you've got to keep vaccines between 2 and 8 degrees. If that cold chain breaks down and the vaccine either heats up and denatures or freezes and thaws, that denatures them too. So you have to maintain a cold chain from the minute it leaves the manufacturer, which could be in New Jersey somewhere, all the way to Junior, who could be living in a very remote region in Mexico or a remote region in Ghana. That cold chain, every transaction along that cold chain has to be validated, and when Junior gets the vaccine, that vaccine has to be absolutely kept in that temperature range. The problem is that the energy chain breaks down. So we have blockchain, supply chain, energy chain, and cold chain. The energy chain breaks down, so where are you going to plug the refrigerator into in the very remote parts of the world? There's no electricity, right? But that's wrong. There's an enormous amount of electricity in the developing world, and it's in the private sector. What private sector? The cell towers. How many people here have traveled around the world? Who are here? How many people have had cell phone access when they traveled around the world? You have. When you look at the distribution of cell towers around the world, it's basically almost 100% covered. And so that private sector has every incentive to keep the energy on. Sometimes they're on the grid. Most often they're on their own energy supply, diesel, sometimes renewable energy, solar, wind, but they keep the energy on. So we solve this, when an academic solves a cold chain, a problem, what do? We don't really solve it, we write a paper. So we wrote a paper and put it in the New Scientist saying all you need to do is take vaccine refrigerators, plug them into the cell tower, and then distribute the vaccines using the energy at the cell tower to keep them cold and the connectivity at the cell tower to send out messages to the healthcare worker, and you've solved the cold chain problem. So we wrote that as an abstract solution. Within a few years, we now have over 300 sites in Zimbabwe, of all countries.
Wow.
500,000 kids have gotten vaccines through our system. We just signed an MOU with the government of Myanmar, and we're interested in now going and expanding all throughout Myanmar. I'm off to Ghana to finish the MOU with Ghana, where they want us to be in Upper West, Upper East, and in the Volta Lake District. So we go where we're needed. Where are we needed? The Ministry of Health, the public sector tells us we need to be this coverage. We go to the private sector and say, do you have a cell tower? We have never found an area of the world where there's not a cell tower within 2 kilometers. And so we've basically solved that problem. But what haven't we solved? We oftentimes don't know what's in the refrigerator. So where does the blockchain solution come in? The blockchain solution comes in validating and tracking and tracing every step along the way. The counterfeit medicine community is about $1 trillion business. How do you prevent counterfeit medicines from entering a chain? Well, that's blockchain technology first and foremost. If you can't validate the block before you, you can't enter the chain. So we can keep out counterfeit medicines from the blockchain. We need a unique identifier at the end. We need to have an identifier for a kid like you're doing in Bangladesh. We need to have unique identifiers on the agent. So there's now this Drug Supply Chain Security Act where eventually we'll have a unique identifier on every single agent. We just match them up, we put it on a blockchain, and David will talk about how hard that's a simple thing to say, but to do it in a low resource environment like Zimbabwe or Myanmar, that's a great challenge. But that's the challenge we have to face together. How do we make public-private partnerships to do these very important, socially impactful projects that I think blockchain clearly has a role to play?
Thank you, Harvey. Tony, you are thinking about using blockchain to give identity to the refugees, especially the Rohingyas. And those who don't know who Rohingyas are, these are millions of people who are refugees between the border of Bangladesh and Myanmar, and they are rejected by both countries, let's just say, and so they are stateless. And so you're thinking about issuing them identities so they can get relief, they can get aids, education, even college degree. I mean, this could be transformative. Why don't you go and tell us some of the projects that you are involved with, including Rohingyas, Jordanian refugees, and so forth. Yeah, if you could please.
Yeah, so much of the work that I do is about humanizing the perspective that we have about the interdependency of humans and systems. Because so often, when we think about a system, so many systems are building systems for other systems. But that value chain is wrong. Because at the end of the day, none of these systems exist without us, human life and human beings, and the ultimate capacity for human potential. Now, I don't know how many people in this room have ever been to a refugee camp, but it is literally where human potential goes to die.
Yep.
We cannot live in a world where we sacrifice our accountability to each other at such an extreme. And this problem in and of itself is a systemic issue. Because if you're someone living in a refugee camp, whether you're a political refugee or someone who will be a refugee from the climate devastation that we could experience on our planet, you simply don't have enough information as an individual going in if you're going to apply to a host nation. Host nations can't understand if you're just giving them a fingerprint who you are as a person. We don't have a portrait of information. And so my work with Web of Trust is a fully open source standard humanizing the perspective that we have on each other's identity and our own sovereignty in relation to the way we apply for dynamic new forms of citizenship. So in the case of the Rohingya, by the way, can I get a little bit of a survey? How many people were in the room yesterday for the panel that I was on? Quite a few. I just don't want to repeat anything. So for example, if you are a refugee, if you are a Rohingya, and you want to apply for citizenship, if you go in as just a number, what does that mean? What does that mean to a country? They don't know. But if you go in and you say, well, so, I don't have a passport, I escaped from a war-torn area, but I did bring my mom with me. So my mom can verify who I am. And I do know these guys who I built a house for. I've known them for 5 months. They verify me on the system. So the country I'm applying to knows I also have skills as a carpenter. And I taught these 3 children English. And so they can verify they've known me for 3 months. I've given them English language speaking skills, so I have abilities as an educator, and I'm also an English speaker. Now, that is actually a human being, right? And so what we're working on is, humanizing not only our perspective toward our relationship for each other, but also an understanding how do we actually use blockchain technology to provide new opportunities for people who may never, for their whole life, have a national identity. That is a real serious question that we're going to have to ask ourselves in the future moving forward. The entire continent of Nigeria realistically could be underwater. What are we going to do with all of these people? Because if we're experiencing so many challenges now, how are we going to create new forms of opportunity, new evolutions in distributed healthcare and distributed education? And fundamentally, how are we going to be able to create new forms of society from the ground up for people who will otherwise have no options at their hands? The Rohingya are a particularly interesting use case because there are 1 million people, you guys, 1 million people. That is the density of like an entire urban environment in some instances, right? There are 1 million people that have appeared outside of Bangladesh in the last 3 years. That number is going to increase exponentially over the next 10 to 15. These are real serious issues, and we have to be aware of these problems. And if we're going to think about implementing solutions, those solutions fundamentally have to be open source. They have to be a public good. And this is something important for everyone in this room to understand just from a broad perspective about blockchain. If you're going to create a token set and if you're going to create a blockchain project, if you're not creating a public utility, you are fundamentally not creating a blockchain. And you're fundamentally not creating a new form, a new economic asset, and a new series of token classes. Because the entire point of blockchain technology is that we are creating new forms of economy as an open source public utility. And if you're doing anything else, not in ethical alignment with the perspective of the industry. So the open source standard we're creating is called Web of Trust. And my broader project to provide overarching opportunities to people that are, the most oppressed populations in the world is called culture. And I'd also like to send a big extend a big thank you to Mir and to all of like our elders here. And all of my friends here.
Come on, they're not that old. Come on.
No. I mean, I was adopted by an indigenous family, so it's the idea of an indigenous elder as someone who leads our society into the next generation. So my adopted father is the leader of the Dakota and the Chickasaw. So. And the Four Worlds Foundation, et cetera. So I wanted to extend a big thank you to everyone here and to all of you for being here and really being a part of the change. Thank you.
So Lionel, let's, thank you, Tony, thank you. Lionel, let's talk about microfinance, right? Now, I have a president here who popularized microfinance in Mexico, but President, as you know, microfinance, the interest rate is very high, right? It's because it's a lot of cost involved to write a small loan. Now with the blockchain, we are solving a lot of it, hopefully there are adoptions. I will come back to you about the adoption, but let's, Lionel, why, President is not that familiar with blockchain. Why don't you kind of explain and the audience, how blockchain can be used to lower the interest rate?
Okay, it's working, great. I will take a little step back. I was in Davos 1 week ago for the World Economic Forum, and there was 3 keywords in Davos. The first one was blockchain. The second one was digital identity, and the third word, word was environment and climate change. And the big challenge for me, as I finance a lot of crypto events during the World Economic Forum, and the big challenge was to put around the table regulators, politicians, blockchain savvy geek, all this kind of person. It was a real lack of this kind of event during this session, so it was a big challenge for me, but it was pretty interesting to organize this kind of big discussion. And what surprised me a lot, there is a lot of, I'm not a geek, I'm not a blockchain savvy as well. I come from the financial industry. And there is a lot of haters and lovers in the blockchain, around the blockchain landscape. But what's blockchain allow me to understand, this is the first example where we can see how it's easy to create a peer-to-peer economy. This is the baseline. And this peer-to-peer economy can have a real impact on, let's say, 3 main sectors: the agriculture sectors, the health sectors, and the financial inclusion sectors. And when I say health sectors, I include, let's say, climate change, who can have an impact on health for person in Africa or this kind of.
So how does the blockchain reduce?
I will. A quick example. How can we solve, let's say, lung problem or diarrhea problem in Africa? We find an answer, and the blockchain gives us the answer. We tokenize the carbon credit interests in collaboration with the UNDP in Africa, especially in Rwanda. And so we create a ERC20 token to digitalize the financial flow of the carbon credit interest. So it was a big challenge. It takes 2 years, so it was not the classic ICO timeframe, but it's already live. So we provide a high cooking stove to people in a family in Rwanda, or water filter. These tools create carbon prints, and we resell this carbon print to big institution, organization, or a big corporation to offset their carbon performance. So it was a real use case. It takes a long time because we put around the table, as I told you, a lot of person. But this is an already live and official use case to solve social problem with the tokenization logic. So it was pretty interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So this is microcredit through tokenization.
Okay. So instead of they are borrowing cash, they get digital token in their phone, and instead of a human underwriting, oh, he has a good credit, bad credit, a software does all the work, an algorithm, right?
Yeah.
So you lower the human cost. Also, the payment is also automatic, right? It gets from the wallet to directly to the loan provider, peer-to-peer lending. And as a result, it reduces costs significantly. So it brings back to my question, President, you champion microfinancing, and in the world, like I'm from Bangladesh, microfinancing is huge. You are a dear friend to Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Prize winner. Now, how did it work? I mean, obviously it benefited a lot of people in Mexico. Do you see room for improvement on the interest rate? What has your experience been with microfinancing? Has it been as successful as you hoped?
Well, I think first step 25 years ago was making people bankable. Only 25% of Mexicans were bankable or crossed the door of a bank. Only 25%, the other 75% moved on cash. And this brought problems, fiscal problems. It brought in high interest, brought in blackmailing with loans and so on and on. So that was the first step, to make people bankable. Today, the system, the problem of the system of the micro lending that those who developed it have found out is that if you don't make it sustainable, at the very end it doesn't work and takes you to high interest rates, and you're wasting money at the very end. So it has to be a combination of technology, control, software, so that you make the transferences by themselves much less costly. Because having a guy going out to visit all these 20 people groups like the Grameen banks promoted, 12 to 20 people, you need a guy to go there on a bicycle or a motorcycle or a car, and begins to get very expensive. So small loans, micro loans become very expensive. And that's why the high interest rate. It has not been yet solved. In Mexico, it's moving from the original micro lending concept into a blend with banking, real technology, supported banking, but you lose part of the social great things that it had, because you're becoming more of a bank than a bank. Muhammad Yunus changed his mind. Now he moved from micro lending to social responsibility, social investment. And he's convincing large corporations like Nestle in Bangladesh, where Nestle accepted to put a second facility, a second manufacturing place to produce products for the poor, keeping and generating the profits and the income on the regular Nestle corporation. So a lot of new ideas have to come, and again, I think here there is something being discovered, something being born with this great concept that I'm sure is going to impact many of the things that are being doing massively, especially on social responsibility and with the poor.
Sure. Thank you, President. So this brings back to David Crosby. David, you are looking into how we can use blockchain in the developing countries like Mexico and Bangladesh, right? Mexico is way richer than Bangladesh, we shouldn't say in the same breath. But those countries don't have a lot of bandwidth. They don't have a high-speed internet. How do you use blockchain, which takes a lot of processing power, takes a lot of data? Is it practical? And what is the solution? We know currently we don't have the solution, but you are working on it, so why don't you tell us a little bit? Yeah.
So first of all, what societies are built around trust. And traditionally, that trust comes from either a government institution or from some form of church. And in those pyramids, in that power structure, you're able to do business, you're able to trust people who are not your immediate family. What distributed ledger allows is you to trust people without those trust structures in place. And that's why, for example, Zimbabwe is a much better use of payment by cryptocurrencies than, say, Singapore, because it's in competition with a trust structure that's very weak.
Yep.
So I would argue that the benefit of the distributed ledger is far greater in societies where there's limited trust. And those are more developing and lesser developed countries. The problem is that the way we built our technology requires always-on high-speed connectivity. We require high-speed nodes. We have a distributed database, which in the case of Ethereum is 150 gigabytes, very, very large. That is not practical to access if you're in a rural hospital in Kenya. So how do you adapt the technology in such a way that it'll continue to provide the same benefits, but in a low bandwidth environment where you don't always have connectivity, where your primary computing platform is a smartphone and a fairly old, low power smartphone at that, where you don't have continuous power and you have limited storage. And that's what we're working on. We're working on enabling this technology to work in the example that my colleague Harvey has talked about. In a rural hospital in Kenya, when that box arrives and you take the vaccines out, when you take the medicines out, and you look at them, you can actually look at a definitive database and say, yes, I trust that vaccine, I am going to inject it into that small child.
David, when do you expect this technology to be ready for developing world like Bangladesh, Mexico, where we can approach the president and say, hey, now we have the technology, why not adopt it, reduce the interest rate, help people? Unless we have the technology, we cannot do this. So what is your timeline like? When do you think we would have a technology that is a low bandwidth, doesn't take a lot of data, and can be used on a $10 phone?
So you start with what you have and you make it work, and then you do incremental change. And as each incremental change goes on, you can address a greater and greater share of the population.
Sure.
So you're looking at a project that's going to take a number of years until you get to every part of the world. But you can start off in communities which have better bandwidth. They might have 3G coverage, and you move to areas which only have 2G coverage.
Sure.
So you're looking 6 to 9 months for the first rollouts.
Wow, that's very quick. And if that happens, then President is a champion of microfinance, and we have an opportunity to work with the President. Before I go to Miko, you also mentioned about YOLO revolution, right? And you are really excited about probably using blockchain to help develop a platform that helps both financing of the farming equipment that you need to increase your yield, as well as perhaps the data and analytics that you need to see why the yield is not moving up and so forth. And blockchain can do a lot of the supply chain related work and also the financing and tracking related work. And I am proud to say that we had a small meeting with Professor Harvey Rubin and David Crosby yesterday, and it seems that it is entirely plausible that we may be able to use blockchain right in our backyard, Mexico, right? And where most of our food comes from. So US has a huge interest in seeing the Mexican farmers are sustainable, they are profitable, and they provide high quality food. It's a win-win for both sides, right? So, Mr. President, this is a crowd where you have all the talent, crypto talent, and so forth. And I thought, if you talk about it, maybe people would be inspired and they will come and see you and say, President, I have an idea. So why not you go and tell a little bit of your vision about the Mexican farmer, especially in the southern part of the country?
Well, thank you. Partially, I already described the project that we're calling Yellow Revolution, comparison with the Green Revolution of Burlong. And I think I have the men to do that. And it's a wise man. It's not profound technology. It's operating correctly, with quality, with efficiency, with other characteristics. So that's one project. It has to do with 3.5 million farmers in Mexico, because with the agrarian revolution, in Latin America's countries, we fraction the land too far more than needed. So you have very small pieces of land that don't have the capacities, that the people is not trained, the farmer, that he doesn't have the know-how. So if under a controlled system we can bring those ingredients to that farmer, the miracle will happen. So that's one way to go, and it's 3.5 million, mostly indigenous, mostly the poor in Mexico. The vanguard is maybe 250,000 farmers that have great pieces of land that produce with great efficiency and that produce about 80% of all food that is produced in Mexico by those 250,000 farmers. But we have 3.5 million that are low subsistence farmers. I have another project which is very interesting in Mexico that we're considering because we're a think tank in Central Fox. That's our dedication. The other massive problem would have to do with education, would have to do with jobs, would have to do with the skills. In Mexico, we have 8 million young people, young population, 8 million that are what we call ni. Neither they go to school, neither they have a job or work. So they are just there without doing anything, and tempted to join the cartels, tempted to migrate, tempted to look for other alternatives. So we have 8 million people where you have to match the employer with the employee and with the academy or the education system. And that's just a platform like I think blockchains are, and, but it's a massive platform because all those 8 million, maybe 20% would have a mobile or would have access to internet. The remaining they don't have, so how can you get them in, list them on the database, know about them, have their characteristics, their age, and then once you have that registered, then the rest will have to do with the employers. They do have the data, they do have the internet access, so that's easy to get. So the employer, the unemployed, and the academy. And this in the United States is already working at level of excellence with the community colleges, because community colleges really at the very end produce professional technicians in 2 years. And that's something we should do in Latin America. Reduce the 5 years of a university, takes too long, and it's not efficient enough. We must reduce quick learning to 2 years to 1 year, professional skills, just like Germany does. That's what we should be doing in Latin America, but that's why this system could bring us to being effective in solving the problem of these ninis, 8 million ninis.
Thank you, Mr. President. So very, very topical. Miko, all these great projects that people are talking about, like farming, education, agriculture, they have a huge social impact, right? But when I talk to investors, they don't like social impact projects because they have this perception that social impact projects are not sustainable, they are charity. You are an investor, you run one of the largest fund, right? Very large fund in blockchain, and you are doing well. So why don't you debunk the myth that social impact projects don't make money?
Well, so I have a very simple mindset. What is the single most valuable crypto asset? It's very simple. The single most valuable crypto asset is Bitcoin, right? If you read the Bitcoin white paper, what is it called? Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper, Bitcoin, open source, peer-to-peer money, right? What is important about that? What is important is peer-to-peer, as our panelists said, and as Tony said, open source, right? What is open source and what is protocol? What these things are is they compete for consent, right? Why does the internet exist? Why does the internet have a billion users? Because it has successfully competed for the consent of the users, right? So if you really think about where this entire game is going, there are 4 billion under and unbanked individuals in the world, and if you want all of those people to have 10x or 100x of their current income, that is huge global growth potential. And I can tell you that Goldman Sachs will not grow by 10x or 100x. So, you know, the growth is in there. And the marginal cost of adding an account at that level with a protocol and open source based community is marginally close to zero. So that is where the value will be. So that's my point.
Thank you, Miko. With that, I just want to mention that a McKinsey report recently said that the market size of the unbanked, if we give them the access to $10 smartphone and the mobile banking, that's a $380 billion market, right? So helping the poor is a good business, Miko. All right. So with that in mind, President, I want to thank you on behalf of the panelists, on behalf of all the audience, that you have done a remarkable job in your whole life. And we are happy to have you for the blockchain. Just like I said, blockchain is about empowering people. And you are face of empowering people. So anything you do to help us and help this community to do all these projects that we want to do and create real impact would be immensely helpful. And we look forward to working with you and the people of Mexico. And this would be a win-win for everybody. And I am really excited, with that, Valentine, why don't you take over? You have some announcement to make, right?
Yeah, so thanks a lot. Mir, you gathered very exciting people. So please be like Mir. Join Mir and us with next forums and bring great people. Magnet to your friends. Together we can do something.
Yes,
great.
Together.
Yeah. So let's leave a space for 2 questions, right? And then we will make our big photo and move for a short break, right? Okay, just 2 questions, please. This one. You can come, yes, to the microphone.
So just want to say thank you. This has been an awesome panel. To your point about to President Fox, I have a question around when you sit and everybody's thinking about how do you regulate blockchain. When you've, beyond blockchain, since you said you didn't have too much knowledge about it, when you've thought about introducing a new technology, what's your thought process as far as being a policymaker and crafting legislation around it? And what would you recommend around introducing blockchain from a regulatory perspective?
Well, when the key word is trust. If every human being would be trustable, you don't need regulation. Everybody would behave with ethics. But that is not the real world. So regulations are important. Now, here there seems to be a breakthrough to avoid as much as possible regulations so that innovation moves freely. And this peer-to-peer could be the answer, because those 2 peers will trust each other. Who knows? As I said before, I'm learning. I am experiencing now all of this, but I think it's fantastic to have new ideas, new ways of doing things. And so that's what I would expect. I was commenting yesterday that the original bankers, those from the Jewish community, those in Florence with the Medicis, that they became great global bankers, they had to create something that people will trust and that would deposit their money in those banks. So in a way, that ingredient of trust must be the substitute for regulations, if we can get up to that point.
Thank you. Somebody came to me and said that, and okay, you are next one. Somebody said that Switzerland government accept taxes in Bitcoin, right? And the question was how to do it in Mexico, how to kind of what to tell to Mexican government so they accept taxes in Bitcoins, right? It was your question. Okay, so last question, please. Yeah.
Hi, I just had a question for Señor Presidente. I think one thing that might be interesting to us here is from your perspective as a political leader, the basis of blockchain is decentralization. So to some degree, its essence, its nature is the removal of central power, distribution amongst the people. So from your perspective as a political leader, I'm curious in terms of how it can help us maybe give guidance in terms of direction of the products and things we build. What scares you the most? What are the things that you as a political leader what scares you the most in terms of decentralization, and how might that affect how we might think about in terms of building things going forward?
So what he's saying is, if there is no central government, decentral, everything decentral, there is no bank, there is no central government, is that a good thing, bad thing? You know, what would happen? Yeah.
Okay, there is a thesis or hypothesis that maybe communities, societies, and nations would work better with less government and more people, and more decentralization and more responsibility on people. But we have been moving on that pendulum all along. And at the very end, I would come back to human behavior. We have had to built-in institutions and built-in governments and built-in academies and everything else, thinking that we're going to be working much better, that we can allocate the effort to different institutions, to different people, to different classes within society. And so that's democracy. And up to now, we have not discovered anything better than democracy. I have the feeling, by seeing that democracies are not delivering most anywhere in the world, that there is big complaints about democracy, big complaints about governments and the establishment, that we seem to be on a path towards dismantling all of this that we have constructed for such a long, long time. My feeling is that we might be close to being born a new way of a working democracy and building through a new way of electing leaders or governments. And when you see a place like China that moves on this 5-year business plan so effectively, and when you see some of our nations that we don't finish to get democracy to work fluently, to reach consensus, to reach decisions, which is supposed to be that democracy will take you to majority or collective positive thinking, but it's not happening. The conflict between the structure of democracies is terrible. Look at just Democrats and Republicans. Every day, like dogs and cats, everyone fighting the other. And nobody thinking about the nation or thinking about the future. It's just, how do I destroy the other? How do I get to government on the next term? Not how do I do better for the next generation. In Mexico, it's terrible when we have 11 political parties, just each one against the other. And no consensus, no nothing, everybody criticizes. This world image that we have today about violence doesn't correspond to the facts in Mexico. Our crime rate is around 16.5 crimes per each 100,000 inhabitants today. And that's the way you measure crime rate, by the number of homicides compared to 100,000 citizens. 20 cities in the United States are way above the average of Mexico, the 16.5. A good world average would be 10. Countries that are below 10 are in good shape. Countries that begin to go up begin to get into problems. When I left government, and I want to be very humble with this, Mexico reached its peak best crime rate position, 9 out of each 100,000 inhabitants. But the next president decided to bring in the army to fight the cartels and go to a war against drugs and cartels. That same year that he took that decision, the crime rate went from 9 to 28. Just that same year, because he put everybody to fight each other. And so it's a very complicated matter. How do you move into the future? But I like parliamentarian systems better than presidential systems, because having the red button in hands of an empty-headed like Trump and discussing with his kid in North Korea, discussing like kids in kindergarten, the two of them. It's incredible that we, the whole world, can be destroyed by these two empty-headed, supposedly leaders. So I don't like to see the world, my nation, in hands of one guy. We need to have checks and balances. We need to have effective democracies, but it's not working right now. It's not working. And so I hope something new comes out of this combination.